of Taking Back Islam. What does the title of this book mean, Taking Back Islam?
This is a book by American Muslims. There are 40 or so articles by people who live here in the United States who happen to be Muslim. And after 9/11, as one of the first articles implies, there was a little more hijacked than airplanes. One of the things that was hijacked in many ways was the religion of Islam. And Muslims felt it more acutely than other people perhaps, but it was a very big problem, and of course it remains one. And the majority of Muslims, I think, were hoping that someone amongst them would speak up and talk a little bit about how opposite the whole language of Al-Qaeda is to the religion of Islam, how manipulative it is. And many of the essays in this book do address that in some way. So when the title says Taking Back Islam, the notion is that there's a religion here that's been hijacked by a very small minority of anarchic people who would like to control the oil fields of various nations. And they're at it in a very serious way with hundreds of millions of dollars behind them. And we have voices. That's what we have. So in this book, we've tried to gather some of those voices together.
How was this book organized, and how did you select which essays to use?
Well, all of these essays have one thing in common. They all appeared on the World Wide Web in one place. They all appeared on an internet magazine called BeliefNet.com, which is a large collection of literature and comments and articles and news about all the religions of the world. And there's a page for each one of them, and there are many pages. And then, of course, those pages break down into many others. All of these articles appeared there in the 18 months following 9/11, 2001. And the articles are not academic essays. They're organized in order to give readers who know very little about Islam a fresh look at what I would call the hot button issues. Islam and gender. We hear a lot about Islam and gender. So what do Muslims actually have to say about that? Not sociologists at various universities who are studying it from outside, but what do people who are living this have to say about it? What about Islam and violence? What is the relationship? There certainly has been an awful lot written about it by people who know very little about Islam. So what do American Muslims have to say about that? What about Islam and other religions? That's a whole section. And again, we've heard lots of what I would call nonsense about Islam and other religions. And I think in many cases the half dozen articles in this book begin to set that record straight, because in fact Islam recognizes itself as a cousin and a descendant of the Judaism and Christianity. So there's a strong monotheistic relationship between religions that we know very well here in this country. As with everything to do with Islam, there are a lot of stereotypes around it. There have been long before 9/11. And this book tries in its table of contents and in its organization to address head-on some of those stereotypes and allow American Muslims, born and raised here, to speak to those notions and to, in some cases, correct perceptions, in other cases, embrace new concepts and expand upon some of the stereotypes that do have roots in reality. There are gender problems in every religion in this world, and Islam is no exception. So we have some very straight talk in this book as well, which is good to see. The table of contents, just a little walk through it, tells you a lot about the book. That's what I've just tried to do with you.
And who are some of the people who have contributed their essays?
Well, we bookended this collection with two Brits. Everyone else is American. But Karen Armstrong has such a powerful voice and she is such a gifted writer and also a good historian. that we thought we'd let her frame things a little bit. So there are actually a couple of essays by her on different topics, but the opening one begins to explain a little bit of what has happened amongst Muslims and in her country in England since the 9/11 2001 attacks. And then at the end of the essays, we asked Cat Stevens, the singer, to have a comment. And of course, he's British as well. So there we have history on one end and culture on the other coming from abroad. Those topics are also dealt with by a number of people inside the book who are American Muslims. Some of my favorite essays in this book are Asma Gul Hassan. Her Sex in the City is really about women and gender and her own relationship to romance and being a young woman in America who was born and raised here and is also a practicing Muslim. What are the fault lines? What are the contradictions? And how do you live that life? It's a very interesting essay in that respect. There's another article by a woman named Keshia Ali, who's a very gifted scholar at Brandeis University, who takes on and looks at some of the actual gender problems in Islam, not only around the world, but in family structure, exactly what that is about. And she does a very good job of separating out the notion that Islam and only Islam oppresses women, and begins to look at what is going on in both her religion and in other religions and cultures around the world. Very nice essay, that one too. There's several pieces by African Americans dealing with race and Islam that are very penetrating, very interesting. Akbar Muhammad has a professor at, I believe is at SUNY Buffalo. In any case, he's upstate New York. Very lovely and prescient kind of essay there about African American Muslims who make up about 30% of all Muslims in the United States, something we often forget. There are about 7 to 10 million Muslims in the U.S. who are citizens, and 30% of them are African American. They have deep roots in this country, going back to the 18th century. So there are some very nice pieces on music and culture in general toward the end of the book. Kabir Helminski, who is an American Muslim, has quite an interesting essay on mysticism and Sufism and Islam. So those are a few pieces to look through.
What was your major motivation to write this book?
I had been a columnist for BeliefNet for about a year, and I had written a few articles of my own and developed something of a relationship with the editors there. And they asked me to do this job for them, basically. They did most of the heavy lifting. We edited this book in about 6 weeks. I wrote all the introductions and sub-introductions, which don't take up very much for him, really. This is, to me, a very enjoyable book to talk about because I didn't write it. I'm really proud of working on this book, and I'm very happy with the outcome, and I don't need to feel like I'm tooting my own horn. This is really the work of 40 other people, 6 very gifted editors at BeliefNet. You know, the man who runs BeliefNet comes from a deep experience in American journalism. Deborah Caldwell, their major editor, is also very long-term, straightforward, wonderful writer and a journalist, and many other people. It's a very interesting group of people to work with.
What do you hope readers will take away from this book?
I would like to see Americans give up on the notion that Muslims are not horrified by terrorism. I would like to see them, by reading some of these essays, listen to what Muslims have to say about their own experience as Westerners. The old saw that democracy and Islam that somehow these two things are inimical, that they're enemies, I think is really an absurd conclusion. I think that I would like to see people understand a little better the common ground that American Muslims particularly have with the rest of this society. These are by and large people who are well educated. Their economy is a little bit above the average American earning. They have mortgages and houses and kids in schools, and they are our professionals, our doctors, our lawyers, our school teachers, etc. They're people who serve this society, and I was very happy to have a little something to do with getting their voice out into the world. It seems that there is a very strong bias in the media where the question recurs over and over again: where are the Muslims? Why don't they stand up and talk? Well, you know they do. They may not have quite the megaphone that some people have in the media, but often the soft voice speaks just as clearly as the loud voice, and sometimes says some more interesting things. So I hope that Americans can take a look at this book. This book won, again, I can say this because I didn't write it. This book won a prize from the Wilbur Prize, awarded by fellow journalists. It was in 2004 awarded a prize for the best book on a religious theme in the country. It's in paperback, it's cheap, it's easy to get, and I understand that it was read throughout the White House about 6 months after it came out. So there are reasons to have a look at this book, and I hope that it will teach Americans a little more about a subject that we're reading about every day, but we seem to have not a very intimate feeling about, an intimate understanding of.
Michael Wolfe, author and editor of Taking Back Islam, thank you.
Thank you.